Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 25th episode of the IDRiM podcast. Today is a continuation of our conversation with Vanessa and Leo from last week, where this week we're going to look more on shelter for LGBTQ plus community and look at the vulnerabilities that the community face. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
We were talking about uh, LGBT communities. People often face discrimination in their homes, and that makes that they push directly to live in unsafe, high risk areas. For example, here in Colombia, such as hillsides or landslides, and informal settlements exposed to flooding, example, or other kind of hazards. So these are sometimes the only places where they can find shelter of live openly without as much fear of rejection. But when the disaster strikes, they are displacement again, and this time into emergency shelters. But sometimes those shelters are even not safe. So it's supposed to be safe. But for many trans, and especially for trans and non-binary people, they can actually be places of rejection or even danger. Even, for example, if you are a trans woman who is
Yeah,
living with HIV or something like that. And my question is, how well do disaster shelters and emergency housing serve trans and non-binary individuals? So how can be safe places for them, and how we are going to change like the perspective of the governments, of the people that it's working directly in the shelters? Because it's supposed to be not places of danger or rejection. Yeah, so I don't know how well do disaster shelters and emergency housing serve trans and non-binary individuals. So what kind of ideas you can provide us, like for the shelters?
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Um, I would say that cultural competency training is extremely important. So having shelter staff and volunteers be aware of sexual and gender identities, as well as appropriate language to be using in different situations. So, for example, instead of assuming like uh, who is your, if you're talking to a woman, like who is your husband, instead saying who is your partner, and also having areas where so oftentimes in shelters there are areas where um, there might be security, and so it kind of it can get a little bit complicated, especially because LGBTQI plus people, especially those with intersecting marginalized identities, may not feel comfortable around security. But I think the main thing about being in a shelter is for queer and trans folks to be in an area in which they feel safe. Um, and so, making sure that there's accommodations that can work for queer and trans people who are going into temporary emergency shelters to feel safe and also be able to access proper sanitation and also bathrooms as well, without any risk of persecution. And so, like, for example, during Hurricane Katrina, there were two transgender women who were arrested for using the bathroom of their gender. And that is very common for trans people, even especially today, and using bathrooms and also just shared spaces in general. And so making sure that those are accessible for everybody. In addition, making sure that staff is trained to not out people, or at least have like a private space to talk with somebody so that that they won't be outed. I think that especially in terms of identification, that can out, for example, a transgender person, because only 10%, 10 to 11% of transgender people in the US have all of their documents actually updated with their name and their gender. Um, In addition, having options for queer families to have their own space as well, or at least a space in which that is maybe protected from others who may discriminate against them. So also like not separating families, which have happened in the past during disasters in the US. Those are some of the things that I can think of. But Vanessa, do you have anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think the other piece of this that I would add in is we've seen a lot of people, for the very reasons that Leo just listed, choosing not to go to shelters and going to these more institutional disaster relief facilities, and instead trying to create alternative systems kind of by and for the LGBTQ community. So we're seeing more LGBTQ centers engaged in disaster relief and recovery, other more even less formal, just kind of community groups. In the queer climate justice movement, people often call these pods. So like, who are the people that you care for, whether it's dealing with the daily disaster of living as an impoverished trans person, or it's a ecological disaster brought on by a hurricane. There are some similar ways that queer and trans people rely on chosen family and these strategies of providing each other with aid. I think that it's one of those things that's always a double-edged sword. Like, if we could actually create a society, a government that valued us and could provide resources, perhaps we wouldn't need these kind of informal systems. But on the other hand, one of the sad things we've seen recently is that over the past 50 years, we've been able to create a whole lot more policy, legislative protections for queer and trans communities, and then had that ripped out from under us. And so I think we're seeing right now in the US kind of a doubling down on the fact that the government is not there for us, and we need to have long-term strategies that are based on caring for each other outside of these systems. And that can mean both, incredible resilience and brilliance, and also incredible precarity, where you have already highly marginalized and impoverished people having to make do without resources. And so I say that as both an important strategy for us to lean into, but not in a way that, sometimes there's this rhetoric around resilience, where there are communities who are resilient, and thus we don't necessarily need to take care of them because, oh, look, they're resilient, they're taking care of themselves. I think one of the things Leo and I were advocating for through Out for Sustainability is to recognize how resilience can be resourced. So what would it look like? Can we imagine a scenario where, the same way our federal government provides funding to faith-based organizations to do disaster response, could we imagine a scenario in which we can get our taxpayer dollars to go to LGBTQ centers that are providing this kind of care for the LGBTQ community? Can we imagine situations like that are about resourcing these alternative modes of care that are already emerging? So that's something I want to add into this conversation.
Yeah, and to add on to that too, there's some research that's currently undergoing right now where me and a few colleagues are talking with LGBTQ plus community centers to discuss disaster preparedness and response. And then one of the overarching themes that's starting to emerge is that they would love to engage in that more for the ones who aren't already, but there's this huge lack of resources and capacity to be able to do that. So, it would be great for LGBTQ plus community centers to also act, for example, as a temporary emergency shelter or to provide different types of disaster relief. But if there's no space, there's no way to add on to a building or be able to get the resources or the certification to become a place of shelter, then it's not possible. So definitely, like a lot of funding and resources should go to LGBTQ plus organizations who already know how to take care of the community, and also LGBTQI plus community members also feel safe and would want to go to those places.
No, thank you so much. I think that it's really important to talk about that. And even when we were talking about like discrimination interaction before, during, and after the disaster. So in this case, you were talking about organizations and how they are promoting like and helping people inside the shelter. So even when institutions fail, communities often don't. And around the world, queer advocacy groups have stepped up to support their own during the disasters. So I want to know what role do LGBT communities organizations play in relief and long term during the recovery? So if you can provide me like examples or something related to this, that should be wonderful as well.
Leo, I would love to hear if you feel like sharing more about the conversations you've been having with LGBTQ centers and what you've been learning through those.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is very preliminary so far, so I'll just caveat with that. But kind of what we've been learning is that we have been in contact with a few that have already been providing disaster preparedness and response for communities. There are a few that are very engaged. For example, the Montrose Center in Houston, Texas, that was able to provide disaster relief services after Hurricane Harvey. There's other LGBTQ plus community centers that have been able to work with pride organizations to provide funding to LGBTQ plus community members after hurricanes and wildfires. There's also been not people that we've talked to, but during Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, there were several LGBTQ plus grassroots groups that were able to raise up money and provide both funding as well as like food and other necessary resources to LGBTQ plus individuals, but also others in the community as well. There was actually, it was pretty cool. There's a restaurant that is owned by a trans person that was able to provide, like, for example, free hot meals. And honestly, Hurricane Helene was kind of one of the best examples that I've seen, at least that was like widely documented, that there's just so many different groups, LGBTQ plus run groups that were providing relief during that time, especially in Appalachia. And I think that for those who haven't really been engaging in disaster response and preparedness, it was mostly that they were discussing how anti-LGBTQI plus bills is at the very forefront of their minds and being able to provide people with very basic needs and services, which in a way is disaster preparedness, but it just wasn't really framed that way for them. And so, you know, I think there's a huge need to tie in and connect how anti-LGBTQI plus bills can also create this disaster risk for LGBTQI plus people, and that in order to provide disaster or equitable disaster preparedness and response for LGBTQI plus people also requires LGBTQI plus affirming bills and bills that are providing the rights to LGBTQI plus people. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that, which is that I'm also seeing some really creative ways to engage in preparedness and thinking about things like, there's this great group in Puerto Rico called Albanisteria en la Bodega, which they are focused on access to and training in tools. So thinking about things that are highly gendered in our society, like who gets to access tools, who gets trained in them from a young age, and how does that then contribute to your ability to take care of yourself or your family in the aftermath of a disaster, especially in a context like Puerto Rico, where people very much feel on their own and don't have as much support from the federal government. So, being able to have a chainsaw and to know how to use it can make the difference between being able to clear your driveway and get someone to the hospital and that person dying in your house. And so like that's something that I've seen is LGBTQ groups, because they face these daily forms of discrimination related to our patriarchal society. I think they have a unique lens on some of these ways that our highly gendered society make certain communities more vulnerable. And so we can see these new institutions forming that are trying to address these really specific things. And sometimes we don't see that as disaster preparedness. Like Leo was saying, whether it's bills, trying to do progressive policy, or just having a handy queer tool day to have LGBTQ people feel more confident in using power tools. These are things that are actually working far upstream when it comes to our gendered society to help people feel, and not just feel, to help people be more prepared for disasters when they come.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's right as well. And also it's important that, for example, in case in Colombia, like coming back to for some questions before, in Colombia, we as a government, even we don't collect any kind of data for LGBT communities in disaster risk management. So, for example, in a global level, it's really hard to fight for inclusion when you are not even count. And the truth is that many disaster assessments don't collect any data for LGBT communities. And I think that should be really important, because the data is necessary for making public policy and even for academic researchers as well. So in this case, as the last question for me, why are queer and trans communities so often rendered invisible in global disasters data?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say I'll start off with globally. I think part of the reason is because there are a lot of countries that are not particularly favorable to sexual and gender diverse individuals. And so, in a way, not believing that those who have differing sexual and gender identities exist, and so they're not going to collect them in the data. I've seen cases, like, for example, in countries that are more favorable towards sexual and gender diverse communities, for example, Canada, they actually had a process where they got feedback and input from LGBTQI plus people in regards to whether or not they should even collect sexual orientation and gender identity data within their census, which could then potentially be used for, environmental and disaster type research. And it came back that many of them actually did not want that. So they ended up not including that within their census for that year. And partially, the reason why is because of security and privacy reasons. They're LGBTQI plus people, it seems like worldwide, are afraid of what would happen if governments have their data and what that could be used for. And this is for very good reason. For example, like in the United States, there are now databases of people whose driver's license do not align with their assigned sex at birth in Texas and potentially also in Florida too. So this can just happen depending on who is in charge of like the administration at the time. There's a lot of people who are afraid of, the fact that this administration in the United States has access to our data and who is accessing that data. So there is very, very good reason for why there is kind of this hesitancy for governments to collect that data. I think the only country that I know that actually collects sexual orientation, gender identity data within their census is Mexico. But that is very, very recent. So potentially at some point that can be used for disaster research. And in the United States, the U.S. Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey did collect sexual orientation and gender identity data as well as disaster experiences. They did that for about 2 years, but that has now been completely scrapped by this new administration. In California, there is very likely they do collect sexual orientation, gender identity data. They're one of the only states to do that. New York also does it as of this past year, so they're still collecting it. But California has been doing it for a long time. And so they actually have a survey called the California Health Information Survey or Interview Survey, sorry, CHIS, which collects sexual orientation, gender identity data, health outcomes, and also outcomes related to extreme weather events. So, and also just things related to climate change. So they have information on perceptions of wildfires. Have they been impacted by a wildfire? Was their mental health and physical health impacted by a wildfire? And same with extreme heat. So there's some that does exist, and I would say are really great beginnings and start to how this data could be collected. But I really think there's a need for trust building and a lot more discussions on how to collect this data, especially because sexual orientation, gender identity is not the same everywhere. There are so many different ideas and conceptions of what that means, and so many different language and terms that are used. And so it's how do you do that regionally and locally with input from communities in a way that protects them as well.
Yeah. I'll just echo what Leo said of the issue of data collection, sexual orientation and gender identity data collection is I think part of this larger conversation about data justice. Who is asking the questions? What are they using it towards? In the instance of our governments collecting this kind of data, knowing that the administration changes and then that data changes hands, and who is using it towards what purposes. But the conversations around data justice, I think, are where we can find more of the answers to this. These are conversations that have been really led by Indigenous communities, highlighting how, this kind of data, this kind of information, it can be used towards really liberatory purposes, and it can also be used to further reify colonial systems, to contribute additional violence to Indigenous communities, right? So I think this is just one more node in that larger conversation when it comes to the double-edged power of data and quantitative research. It's both really powerful for advancing progressive policy, but can also systems that have been built through colonial violence, as this particular kind of way of knowing has, can often end up reifying those systems of violence.
And can I just point out that my country does actually collect data in the census of on your sexuality. We started doing it in 2021, but we also do it every year because we know that a 10-year snapshot is not appropriate. And I mean, the most interesting fact that came out in the most recent data is because they actually broke it down. And what was really interesting is if you look at how big the proportion of the community it is, when you get to 16 to 24, they said that if you put the gay, lesbian, bi, others, and those who are either curious or just refused because we know that they're probably scared to say it, it's nearly 15% in the 16 to 24, which surprised every politician that it was so big, because historically we thought it was 2 or 3%, but when we got this proportion that it was nearly 15%, it was like, well, we need to start gearing policy towards this, because this is going to be something that is going to be a bigger issue if there's going to be so many who are LGBT, and we need to make sure that. And I mean, I'd like to think that in the UK we are probably one of the most progressive now in Europe on this issue. However, we've been dealt with a few issues lately about what is it, how do we define a transsexual, where do we put which bathrooms they use, and even the courts can't even agree on the term. And the government and the court are literally disagreeing with each other over how to determine. And we're seeing politicians literally scared to even answer the question because they're worried that they're going to be backlashes against other groups. And I mean, in this issue, I remember the UK nearly tore itself apart because we got one government saying it's this and one government saying it's that, and it literally it became a right old mess, and no one could define what is a trans man, what is a trans woman. It was getting ridiculous. But we know literally everyone was tearing themselves to pieces over it, when it should just be. I mean, personally, I say that it's whatever you've got at this stage, you should, that's it. I mean, it doesn't have to be, because the court said it's by what you were born with. And it's like, not. It's absolutely not. And that's how it is in the UK at the minute. And it seems that the way that we're moving is that if you're LGB, you're fine, but if you're T, we've got so many issues still. But I would say almost the stage of America on that bit.
Yes, highly related across the pond. So highly known, lauded queer theorist Judith Butler recently published a new book called Who's Afraid of Gender? And they trace this anti-trans rhetoric kind of globally, from the UK and the Vatican to Brazil and the United States. And I think that's exactly what they've been highlighting is the interrelationships between these places and this particular kind of rhetoric. So I just want to return to something that I said earlier, which is that one of the lessons from queer ecologies is that actually this planet, the world itself, is incredibly diverse when it comes to how species organize gender, sexuality, kinship, and the idea that there are only two genders, that males are superior to females, and this strict control over sexuality, that form of organizing society is actually the aberration when it comes to the living planet that we're on. And so it's important for us to look upstream at what are the historic forces that have pushed us into this very strict, very unique form of social relationship. And they're often, looking back, we can look at forces like colonization. There's this great trans scholar, Jules Gill-Peterson, that's actually, I think, focused a lot more on UK British colonialism and how that has shaped contemporary gender systems in places like India. So I think that's something for us to really think about, is when these anti-trans, quote unquote, self-described gender critical feminists are using rhetoric that it's actually the trans population that has gotten us confused about gender. I think we actually have a really great set of scholarship right now, both scientific and social science and humanities and arts. We have all forms of different knowledge that point to how incorrect that is, that actually there are way more sexes than male and female. There's so many different ways that our bodies are arranged when it comes to our hormones, to our chromosomes, to our physical anatomy. And there are so many different ways that we could organize our societies when it comes to gender. And so Judith Butler has this line where she says, this kind of form of anti-trans policy, they're often using the language of science in order to protect science from itself, because what scientific knowledge is moving us towards is actually how diverse the gender and sexual diversity of the planet is. And so they're using the idea of science to try and retrench a former, a prior, a colonial scientific knowledge of gender and sexuality. And they're trying to defend that form of science against actually what we now know from a very diverse set of knowledges about, the truth of the diversity of the living planet, which I think the queer and trans community is at the forefront of advancing that story, but it's a story that is for the benefit of everyone. You know, maybe there's 15% of the population that identifies as LGBTQ, but I promise you, almost everyone is in some way, shape, or form influenced by the social scripts that we're given of what we are and are not allowed to do with our bodies, with our territories, the kinds of families we're allowed to make, the kind of work we're allowed to do, how much we should be paid for that work. All of these things are related to gender, and that's actually what's under debate in these anti-trans bills.
Yeah, and I agree. And to add on to that, two things before I move add on to another question on what you've said, is that we must not forget intersex as well.
Right.
Where do we put intersex if you've got two bathrooms? Because they say, oh, it's by the gender you were born with or the sex you were born with. Which one?
Yeah. What exactly do you mean? And intersex conditions they've been framed as conditions, right? We were just talking about that. LGBTQ people for a long time have been framed as conditions. So this is the same thing. Intersex people exist, and the amount, what we've known about intersex embodiments has been increasing a lot in recent years. But like right now, we don't do standard across the board genetic testing of infants when they come out to find out what their chromosomes actually say. And there's some research to suggest that if we were to do that, our ideas of the sexual binary would be shown to be quite naive.
And also to highlight as well, in the UK, but I don't know if it's available abroad, but in 2022, Tom Daley actually produced a documentary with the BBC to say it's illegal to be me. And what he did was he went around the Commonwealth countries and looked at the impact of British colonialism on these territories, because there's a belief that we forced the Christian view of, sexuality onto the local population, and they are now hanging on to it, where we've now moved into a completely, almost gone to their direction of where pre-colonialism was, where it's more free and liberal. And it's quite interesting, the legacy that has had on these countries, in particular in Africa, where these countries are really some of the most strict on, sexual minorities and gender minorities. Yeah, probably were the most liberal 200, 250 years ago. And, the sad impact that's had.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I would just say I think that's true in many instances, and also what I'm reminded by some of the indigenous scholars, here in the U.S. is that we can't say that there was any one way of doing things before colonialism. Really, what we see is that there were thousands of different ways of organizing society. Some of them, which unfortunately may not have been as liberal or progressive when it comes to gender or sexual minorities, but then there are some that were. It's kind of about the monoculture that we have now, where everyone around the world is being forced into one particular mode of being.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, um, very like, so when you look at national adaptation plans, which basically just like outlines how countries are planning on responding to and preparing to for climate change, including climate-related disasters. Cabo Verde and also Ghana both include sexual and gender minorities within their national adaptation plans. And so there is definitely, I would say, not across the board is that happening in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking more of countries in particular, countries like, Egypt, Algeria, but also countries I think of like the Congo and them regions that are pretty hard, still very strict on their belief system. Actually, I wanted to go back, Vanessa, to something you said about the social script, and you mentioned about literally, we have these defined roles, and I actually asked Jason this very same question yesterday, during our recording, and I wanted to know, has the term of masculinity and femininity changed in society? So I'll quickly go through what mentioned yesterday. Was very much masculinity and femininity in the UK is definitely changing from the 1980s to today. So it's very much what I would define it as, it's kind of coming more closer together now. But the traditional that a man had to be this, a man couldn't cry, a man, had to be, strong. It had to, this very much, dominant attitude, and a woman and a femininity was very soft. It was very pink, and they had to just stay at home, and very much that, two-tier system. And I actually said that I felt that in the recent years that masculinity in particular really had changed in a big way, here in the UK, so that 20, 30 years ago, you would not be seen cuddling a friend that was, another man. Today, no one blinks an eye at it. It's a natural, and that huge change on what is acceptable. And I just wonder if in the US that has changed.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and I think just to remember, these ideas of femininity and masculinity, they are derived from a binary gender system. Like, we wouldn't necessarily even be using these words if we, we're having this conversation within a different paradigm, a different ideology. So just starting with that, yeah, these ideas, these stereotypes of femininity and masculinity, I think what the queer climate justice movement has been emphasizing is that they are the kinds of gender stereotypes that were necessary for the project of colonization. So you think about the kind of violence that is associated with toxic masculinity is the kind of violence that you need to murder an entire population of people, to displace them from their land, and to commit the kind of violence against the very fabric of life. Like that's why those particular sets of traits are oriented around this idea of masculinity. They served a particular project. And similarly with femininity and devalued caring labor, you need a community that that doesn't need to be compensated for the work of perpetuating the settler state, birthing the new beings to colonize that territory, and to raise and care for them. So that's an idea that's come from Marxist feminists for a long time, this idea of social reproduction. And so I think if we can name that, femininity and masculinity, the stereotypes that have historically been connected with those are related to a binary gender system that had a particular purpose. I think that's a useful framing. And so then we can say, yes, today there are so many battles over what these terms should mean now, whether we should even use these terms. But how, like, feminism has done so much to expand the category of woman and who can be a woman, what women can do, what can be considered feminine. And I think a slower movement, but one that we have seen is also changing scripts for men. That the same way that feminists have argued that there's nothing essential to the category of women, there's nothing biologically necessarily that makes us want to wear pink, right? Or to cook. Similarly, there's nothing essential to male-born people that makes them violent. And that's actually a very important thing for most men to know and to lean into. And it has had a lot of changes on our ideas of masculinity. But I don't think these have been changes that have happened evenly across the board. Within the US context, we know that there's also this particular kind of what's called like petromasculinity, a particular kind of toxic masculinity that's bred within the boom camps of extractive industries like fracking towns, where you also see high rates of sexual assault against women and surrounding territories from the men in these camps. Right, so the transformations that are happening to gender are constant, and they're different in different places at different times. And I think what the story of the colonial roots of our current gender system can remind us is that these changes, these contests in what these gender terms should mean are often related to much larger political economic debates happening in society. And so the kind of social scripts we're given often have other purposes. What does it mean for us to have a society that believes these things? What political and economic purposes can that society achieve?
Yeah, and actually, because I remember in my PhD, we were talking about gender, because one of the things with climate change we say about, knowledge of, climate change is that historically men are more likely to know about the subject content of climate change than female, and it stems back down to that male, in particular in the UK, male, students will typically do STEM subjects because it's derived into them quite young. But I then questioned in my PhD, was like, well, we have a much more liberal attitude. We've got, metrosexuality, who's very, very much about, almost don't care about, masculinity as the traditional form, and very much, and what does that represent when it comes to subject content? And actually, when you say about as well in the US about, these communities that have this, you said, was it is it hypermasculine? You said, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of my jobs is to go into schools in these communities to teach. And one of the biggest things that has been raised in the UK is to look out for this type of attitude because of the rise of social media, in particular with certain people. And I will name this person, Andrew Tate. And a lot, and it's been a huge concern here in the UK about what is he, how is he influencing the next generation? So Generation Z to move into Generation Alpha, how are they going to behave? And is that changing masculinity backwards? Because in the UK, we were literally making big strides, because one of the biggest things that kills men in the UK is suicide. Where's the suicide drive from? It's from the historical masculinity that you can't show emotion, so you bottle it up to the point that you can't find a way out of it. And that is, it's a very basic concept, but it's a very much a concept that, it rings true in a lot of, men. And it feels like that we were just making that progress to getting, a lot of men to open up and being a bit more, to help each other. Concern now is that we might be moving back to where we were historically because of this toxic hypermasculinity, as you term it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know about Andrew Tate specifically, but when it comes to a lot of that kind of the alpha male podcasting world, like I was saying, Leo and I were both just interviewed for this article that came out this morning. One of the things that they showed is that the Daily Wire, which is a right-wing media company that promotes that kind of podcasting, folks like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, that the startup funding to make the Daily Wire possible ultimately came from fossil fuel funding. So again, thinking about what are the economic and political purposes that our gender system is being leveraged towards. I think that's one of the major questions for me at this moment. Yeah,
and also thinking too about like emergency management, where masculinity is often assumed to be kind of like how folks who work in that space are supposed to be. It's often thought of as like a masculine space. And there's been some research about like the experiences of women and lesbians and bisexual women in terms of both working within emergency management, but also how they may be treated by emergency management workers. And often it's like this space where, they are maybe overlooked or shafted for those who are more traditionally masculine or male. People who are lesbians, bisexual women during disasters they may be mistreated or discriminated against or experience violence, not necessarily from the emergency management folks themselves, but could be because they're not receiving the resources and services from those folks. In addition, very recently during the Los Angeles fires, the fire chief was an out lesbian person, and across the board on conservative news sites, there was just talk about why is she the one who is the fire chief? Why isn't it not somebody who, like, it should be this like hyper masculine male, and we need that person to be in charge because being a lesbian in fire and emergency management meant that she was not qualified to be able to handle that. And so these ideas around masculinity and femininity, like they're as Vanessa was saying, they're weaponized in addition to also impacting people's mental and physical health. And these concepts are social constructs that need to be reworked and rethinked or just completely get away with, because these are all just traits and characteristics that anybody could have, and they don't necessarily need to be aligned or associated with only depending on like what you were assigned at birth.
So thank you, Vanessa and Leo, for today, and we hope to see all our listeners on the next episode of the IDRiM podcast.